Welcome back, PetaPixel viewers. It is Chris Niccolls here, coming to you from lovely Carmel by the Sea, and that's because it's time for our full review on the iPhone 16 Pro and Pro Max for photographers. I've got the Max model here. Jordan is also shooting on an iPhone 16 Pro right now, the whole episode. Let's get to it. As a side note, Jordan's going to be shooting today's episode in HDR, but he'll grade it, so it's going to look fine on SDR displays, don't worry. But I am going to be shooting my photos on the smartphone, and they're going to be coming straight out of camera. Those will be HDR. You know, just keep in mind, it is still best to watch this episode on an HDR display if possible. The other thing I want to mention here is that we are photographers and videographers, so we're not looking at a lot of the phone's features as a smartphone. We're really evaluating these as creative tools to make videos and photography. That's our approach. Let's get to it. So I think it's important to state that I'm actually an iPhone user. I mean, this is the iPhone 15 Pro Max. This has been my main phone for a year, and I have absolutely enjoyed the experience. You know, you get used to the UI and stuff. But we review tons of Android devices on this channel. We just did the Pixel 9. We've looked at the Samsungs, of course, before. And I do really like Android phones. I'm not going to be one of these like Apple's the way to go. But to be honest, the reason why I moved over is because Jaron and Jordan would constantly say, Apple is the way to go. And they're like, one of us. And we want to airdrop you files, and this is really annoying. And so I gave in to the peer pressure, and you know what? I think it does a good job. But I am excited to see what the new 16 Pro and Pro Max will bring to the table. This has got the classic case here. Look at that. I miss my old dirty daddy case, right? With all my cards in there. Like young people don't like it, but old people like it. He gets it. He gets it. And so of course today we're looking at the 16 Pro and Pro Max, and it's important to note that both phones use the exact same camera modules. So I want to talk about the ultra wide first. This has been upgraded quite a bit. It used to be a 12 megapixel single Bayer sensor. It is now a quad Bayer sensor, giving 48 megapixels of resolution. We're still getting the same f2.2 aperture here. It's essentially the same kind of light gathering, but we do now get that extra detail. And when you do macros, and you can get very close, as you can see here, you do get a lot more detail in those macros. So next I want to talk about the 5x telephoto camera module, f2.8. Looks to be basically the same thing that we saw on the iPhone 15 Pro Max. But now you get this 5x telephoto on both the iPhone 16 Pro and Pro Max models. They're not splitting that up anymore. And anybody who's going to be missing that 3x telephoto, I'm sorry to tell you it's gone. Jordan's actually very sad about that. And I do honestly agree, because the 5x telephoto, although I like the focal range, it does need some optical improvement. I mean, everybody's doing a 5x telephoto now, and the Apple is kind of the bottom of the heap. I would have liked to have seen that improve. It's not great in low light. It's not great for video. But the main camera is actually the really big change here. I mean, on paper, it looks very similar. 48 megapixels, you know, f1.78 aperture, very similar, but it now has twice the readout speed. I mean, this has huge implications, not only for video, but maybe even for photography as well, because if this phone can then shoot extra frames and stack them computationally and have more to choose from, we should get even better dynamic range, sharpness, stabilization. All of these have big benefits. So I hope it's obvious now that we're going to be talking about the selfie module here. And sadly, here on the iPhone 16 Pro and Pro Max, we have the same 12 megapixel selfie camera. And even if you have two guys as handsome as us, it can only do so much. Okay, so let's talk about displays now, because we have this very nice bright sun that's just broken out, sweaters off, so this makes a lot of sense to talk about. So we do have larger displays than we've ever seen before on an iPhone here. So the 16 Pro and Pro Max respectively have a 6.3 inch and a 6.9 inch display. They've made the borders really thin. I mean, it is a nice large display. Now I know in my first impressions video I did poo-poo the fact that the displays here only go to 2000 nits of peak maximum brightness, and part of that, you know, is because we are a camera review channel. We do look at specs, we do compare them with other competitions, and the Google Pixel 9 is absolutely surpassing this. But that all being said, shooting out on this bright sunny day, I mean, the screens are still very viewable. I have no problem composing in this bright sunlight. I'm not having a problem with reflections. So this is very much a usable display for composing shots and getting it. Okay, now let's talk about this camera control button, which is getting a lot of hype, but rightfully so. So in an age where Apple has been steadily removing buttons, the pendulum has now swung back, and the iPhone 15 added the action button here on the side, and now the 16 gets the camera control button. So this can do a lot of things. It's a multi-function button. It's got a half press functionality, full press functionality, and a sliding bar. And first off, what I really like using it for is just a quick way to activate the camera module. I can push it once to wake up the camera, push it again, I'm right into the camera module, and I can start shooting. This also now frees up the action button to be customized for other more useful features. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about here is just the actual tactile response from this camera control button. Now, I'm using an Apple case right here, so it does absolutely work with it. I don't know if third-party case manufacturers are going to figure this out right away. We'll see, but it works well here, and you do get haptic feedback. So when I'm sliding here, there's a nice texture on it, but then as I do a half press, I actually do get response underneath my fingertip. And when I press the button in all the way, it actually mimics the feel of an actual camera shutter button. I will say this though, I do find that although there's many ways to hold this camera control button, I mean, I could shoot vertically using this finger here, sliding is kind of awkward, or I can hold it here with my thumb and move it. That's a little bit more easy to use, but you definitely want to have some sort of counter pressure on the other side, especially when shooting that shutter button. I find that right now it takes a fair amount of force to actually push it in all the way, and it's distinctly moving my camera to the side, something that wouldn't happen if I just touched the shutter button on the touchscreen. So once I finally got used to manipulating this button properly and repeatably, predictably, I should say, then I was able to change a lot of manual control settings using this. So I've got exposure control. I can also change the portrait mode depth maps. I can do the zoom. I can pick specific focal lengths, and I can also choose the tone and the style of my image. And it does actually work quite smoothly. I mean, it's a very slick interface. I can also just use my finger right on the touchscreen and manipulate the same controls on there. And so I guess my only real issue is in a more casual situation where I'm shooting like this, just walking around the streets, I'm finding it very easy to use, very fun to engage. It's a brand new experience. But if I was stressed trying to get an action shot, or, where timing is really critical, it can sometimes be a little bit slow. I mean, I don't know, even professional gamers might find this a little bit ponderous to navigate through if you're going to change multiple exposures and then focal lengths. Honestly, I could find that on the touchscreen, I have access to all the same stuff, and it might even be a little bit faster. So one thing I noticed on the iPhone 15, I talked about in a review, is that there's a bit of a shutter delay. And so I actually found what Apple did was they compensated for that with a bit of a timing adjustment. It would actually take the shot from before you hit the shutter, and it usually lined up pretty well. But what I now notice with the iPhone 16 is we are definitely getting a faster shutter response, and it seems definitely more geared to when I actually touch the shutter button. And so I find that this new faster shutter delay just really gets the timing down. For a photographer, it feels like a real camera. So that's a really nice benefit on the iPhone 16 Pro.
Jordan here to talk about the video capabilities on the iPhone 16 Pro, and it's largely unchanged from what we saw last year. Obviously, the big headline feature is we now have 4K 120 as a result of having that new faster sensor, and it's doing 120 frames per second with HDR, which means this thing's reading out at least 240 frames per second, which is incredibly impressive. Now, when you're recording this with the standard camera app and just disregarding the Apple Pro log, it is actually very intuitive, nice small file sizes, and the quality on it is absolutely excellent. The HDR looks good, and we're not seeing a lot of that softening and pixelation that we see with a lot of smaller sensor cameras recording very high-speed video. The limitations come if you do want to take a little bit more control over that. If you want to switch over to log, just like what we saw last year with 4K 60, when you record 4K 120, you're going to have to use an external SSD, and recording ProRes HQ at this frame rate, it means the files are absolutely massive. I've recorded a ton of footage. I'm looking forward to getting it back on the computer and checking it out. And I know Chris wants to take a look at all of his photos. So we'll see you all tomorrow in a place that's going to be exactly as beautiful or more beautiful, right, Jaron?
Right.
And we will see you with more of our results.
And we're back for day two. We're coming to you from the lovely Seascape area just outside of Santa Cruz. And we had a really busy day yesterday, a really fun day. We did a lot of video shooting, a lot of photography. And so first thing I want to touch on is battery life. It is improved now on the iPhone 16 series, especially the Pro and Pro Max. They got new larger batteries. And what we kind of found is this. Jordan's shooting a lot of 4K 120. Really heating up his phone, but he was left with about 30% battery life at the end of the day of shooting. And for me, doing a lot of photographs, I was still well over 50 50%. So these are good results. Now, you know, what Apple is saying is that they have improved battery life. Their metric is video playback time, roughly 4 hours more video playback time than the original iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max. Now, on a related note, let's talk about charging time. So this is kind of a story where in one regard we're getting an improvement, in the other it's more of the same. Wireless charging through the MagSafe adapter is actually quite a bit faster now this year with the iPhone 16 Pro and Pro Max, and that's really nice. It gets almost up to the USB-C wired charging speeds. The sad story is the USB-C wired charging speeds are the same as the iPhone 15, and while not terrible, they're not great either. I mean, you compare this to Samsung or Google really pushing fast charging in their phones, and this is really subpar. We're here at the Wedding Bluff. What a beautiful place to get married. It also happens to be a really nice place to do a flare test. And I want to do this because a lot of iPhone 15 users are complaining about flare on the cameras. So first off, we're going to take a look at the ultra wide here. What I noticed on the original iPhone 15, although we're actually getting, you know, good contrast, we're not really getting any ghosting with the ultra wide, we do get all that rainbow flare around the sun. It's quite vivid. I mean, looking at the iPhone 16, again, no ghosting, similar contrast, but I would say that the ultra wide doesn't have as much of that rainbow reflection. Absolutely. We get the same story. We look at the main camera here. The main camera does have that strange ghosting, looks like an eyeball with a little blue teal pupil. Nothing you can do about that, but the rainbow flaring around the actual light source itself is reduced on the 16 in comparison to the 15, so that is a nice improvement. So I want to talk about something interesting when it comes to file formats here for photography on the iPhone 16 Pro and Pro Max. By default, your standard photos are still going to be HEIF files, and you can do the same thing. Like on the Fusion camera, the main camera, you can do 12 or 24 megapixel photos. You can still do 24 megapixel photos on the 28 millimeter or 35 millimeter digital lenses as well. And then of course the ultra wide and the 5x zoom, you're still going to get 12 megapixel HEIF files from those cameras. But you now have a different format when it comes to RAW formats. This is the first iPhone to now use JPEG-XL, and you're going to hear a lot more about JPEG-XL going forward because I think a lot of other companies are going to really start to get on board and use it in their devices. Basically, what we're going to get with the JPEG-XL file is a DNG kind of RAW file. It's in a DNG wrapper when you bring it into your computer, but it's going to give you the same dynamic range as a RAW, but drastically less file size. Just to give context, if I was doing RAW files on my older iPhone 15 Pro Max, my file size would be roughly 85 megabytes or so on a 48 megapixel image. But if I use the JPEG-XL, it's more like 45 megabytes. So I'm getting basically the same range, but a lot less space, and that's really nice when you want to save storage. So there is another interesting aspect to JPEG-XL files, and that's that the raw data is stored in the file, but also a shareable JPEG file that's all ready to go. Contrast looks nice, you know, looks very standard as far as color goes and stuff. At the same time though, I can easily open up a JPEG-XL file in Photoshop. It'll recognize it as a full raw file. So I know this is a hot take, but I'm gonna go on record and say I don't really much care for live photo, and that's fine. I mean, I'm only bringing it up because there's one thing that I do like to do, that's long exposures, and I still wish that you could do it outside of using live photo. And frankly, you know, we got a shot here. I mean, even with this person not moving, you're still getting this weird blur around them. It's unfortunate. I just wish that there was an actual long exposure mode right inside the camera app itself that I could choose very quickly and easily and experiment with, you know, that actually worked kind of well like Google's does. So Apple honestly hasn't released a lot of new stuff as far as the camera app goes, but I do like the slightly different interface now on the new OS. And I'm also going to say that I do like the new color styles that they're doing and how they're arranging it. So it's really neat that you've got these undertones that you can use. And then to the right of the standard color style, you've got all of your more classic, traditional, vibrant modes or natural modes or your surreal modes like ethereal, luminous, black and white modes, that kind of stuff. But what I like most of all is I can always apply those after the fact at any time, or if I do use a color style and I change my mind, I can change my mind later. That's really good. I also like that there's that touch button so I can customize the color style I'm using. I change the opacity. I can move around the color palette. I mean, really cool stuff. And I also especially like that I still have access to that button when I'm in this standard color profile. This is a major problem with the iPhone 15 last year. If I was on standard, I didn't get access to any of my color styles until I went into one of the color styles. Thankfully, Apple listened to me and they fixed that. So I am definitely going to revisit more about the color styles later when I get back home and really evaluate my photos fully. But for now, let's go to Jordan. There's a lot to talk about with video.
All right, it's day 2 by the beach, so that's why I'm wearing something a little bit more fun, a little beachy, so I can talk about the playback features when we record video onto the iPhone 16 Pro. And one thing Apple made a big deal about is if you use the new slow motion record mode, 4K 120, you can play it right back in the app, going all the way down to 24 frames per second, which is a 5th speed. And this is nice to do, but it's certainly something I could do in post. What I can't do in post now is how they're utilizing the spatial audio. There's 4 microphones in this camera, and after you record all that audio, you can choose how it's distributed in playback.
Chris, I forgot my light meter. Can you teach me how to meter without one?
Yeah, use the Sunny 16 rule because it's bright outside. Just choose F16. Make your shutter speed as close as you can to the ice of your film. You got 400 film?
Yes.
500th of a second shutter speed. You're good.
So what I can choose afterwards is different sound mixes where it's going to put the audio in different places. I think the most useful for a lot of people where it's only going to focus on the audio from what is seen by the camera, what's in front of the camera or behind it, depending on which camera you use.
Chris, I forgot my light meter. Can you teach me how to meter without one?
Yeah, use the Sunny 16 rule because it's bright outside. Just choose F16. Make your shutter speed as close as you can to the ice of your film. You got 400 film?
Yes.
But I also really love this cinema option. When we utilize this, it's going to try and put all of the voices right in the center channel, kind of right in front of you, and move everything else to the surround, just like how they do it in major motion picture films. And honestly, it works extremely well. One other test I wanted to run that I think might be practical for a lot of people is using this exact same tool to isolate so you're only getting sound that is from the cameras that are pointed at you while vlogging. So here we're just using the ambient spatial audio. Okay, so now we've switched over where it is going to isolate the audio specifically to what's being captured by the camera that you've selected. I think it's doing a pretty good job. Now the other thing I've been able to do is review an absolute pile of footage from the iPhone 16 Pro, and honestly, so much of it, if you're using any of the standard record modes, looks exactly like what we saw last year, which if you're using the log recording, I would say is head and shoulders the best video that you're going to get out of any smartphone on the market right now. It's just not a colossal improvement, aside from the fact that we do have that 4K 120p, and it looks beautiful if you're using it in the standard HDR mode, and if you're willing to use a separate app or an external recorder, the log footage at 4K 120 is gorgeous. It doesn't have over-sharpened look we see on a lot of smartphones, and it is very, very detailed. The other thing I was curious about is how the video quality is going to be on the ultra-wide lens, because it is capturing a bit more detail when we're shooting stills. But here, honestly, zooming it in to 400% in the 4K footage, I can't tell a difference between them. So if you're using the ultra-wide all the time and expecting massive video upgrades, you're not going to see it this year, just with stills. That's all the time we have here in beautiful California. It's time to fly back to, well, back to actually still beautiful Alberta, where Chris can shoot some more samples and give you his final impressions on the iPhone 16 Pro and Pro Max.
And we are back. We had a great trip to Cupertino, but now they're back in Calgary at home. I've had a chance to really look at a lot of the photos that I've shot and evaluate them. Now I want to give you my final findings as far as image quality goes. First thing I want to talk about is the new ultra-wide camera, because that is a fairly big hardware change. And it's nice that we now have that 48 megapixel quad Bayer sensor. In most situations though, most people are still going to be shooting the 12 megapixel heaves. Those are going to go onto Instagram, social media, Facebook, and they're going to look just fine. But it is nice that we do have the option now to shoot 48 megapixel RAWs, get a little bit more of that extra detail. As you can see here, there is a benefit to that. And so if you are going to do some ultra-wide landscapes or some really close-up macros and you want to have room to crop a bit or to print a bit bigger, you do have a better option there. I do want to say though, I find it a little bit odd that we don't have a 24 megapixel HEIF option. This is something we do have on the Fusion cameras and the 28 and 35 millimeter focal lengths as well. And I do like that because there is an appreciable benefit to that you can see. Also keep in mind, when we talk about 48 megapixel quad Bayer, we're not talking about the same as a 48 megapixel sensor on a camera like a standard traditional Bayer. Our usable resolution is going to be a lot less than that. But there is a benefit there, although the use case where people might use it is fairly limited. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is portrait mode. Getting these nice, shallow, depth of field looking images, working with better depth maps. This is something that's always improving. It's very competitive across all the manufacturers. And actually, the iPhone 15 did a really good job. We already evaluated last year with our roundup how we really liked how it did those portraits. Very realistic, very sort of natural look for shallow depth of field shots. The 16 Pro, I'm noticing maybe like subtle improvements there. The depth maps are a little bit nicer. The way that it maps out hair is even a little bit more accurate. So it's not a big difference from the 15 Pro, but the 15 Pro is already pretty good to start with. Another thing I would have looked at was low light performance. Okay, this is something that Google has done a really good job of. Apple does need some improvement here. Now, the fact that there's no major improvement in low light actually makes a lot of sense because we theorized with the main Fusion camera having this much faster readout speed, it would simply take more photos and throw them in the stack when it computationally mashes everything together. But that's actually not the case, so that makes sense. They're still sticking to 9 photos maximum in their stack, but this faster readout does give us one appreciable benefit. Normally, there'd be more delay in between those shots, but when you push the shutter now for all your photography with the main camera, you're actually gonna get that stack happening in a much quicker place, much smaller space of time with less delay in between. And that means we're gonna get less ghosting issues if we've got fast movement like kids running around, action, pets, that kind of stuff. Now, I have already touched on picture styles and filters a little bit in this video, but I just want to give it more context. So the iPhone 16 expands quite dramatically what we had on the iPhone 15. The 15 had very basic filters, right? I mean, you could do things like make things more vibrant or more muted. You could do some black and white modes and stuff. And we have a lot of that repeated on the iPhone 16, but it goes beyond that. So the picture styles there, we've got more, surreal ones like ethereal and luminous, but we also have the undertones. And what's neat about the iPhone 16 is this. First off, they're doing totally different file structuring for these picture styles. It's not working the way it did on the 15s. Therefore, even with the latest update, you're not going to get these picture styles on the older phones. This is iPhone 16 and going forward. The undertones are really interesting because when you want to apply a color tone to a photo, it intelligently looks at the scene. It'll also look at people in the scene and what their actual skin tone is. So if I say that I want a warmer tone or more yellow tone, it will not only evaluate the scene, but also what's the original skin tone of that subject. If it already has a warmer yellow tone, it won't just blanket add more warmth to that. It'll do it in a very intelligent way. That being said, if you were to shoot standard mode on both the older phones and this new 16, you'd largely get a similar looking shot. So this is really going above and beyond if you want to play with those filters. And how much you'll do that is really going to depend on you and your style of shooting. Now that we've had a chance to evaluate the phone as well, we already talked a bit about charging and how the wired charging is exactly the same as the iPhone 15. And that's true, but some stuff has come out saying, well, you can actually draw from the charger above 40 watts, way beyond the sort of roughly 30 watts that the charging system would need. And that is true, but it doesn't affect the charging. What it affects is if you're doing something like playing a video game or running intense applications while charging the phone, you'll still get that almost 30 watts for the charger and then a bit of extra draw to run those applications without slowing the charging process down. So the last thing I want to touch on before we begin to wrap things up is just the AI features on this phone as they pertain to photography. And again, I do want to point out as well, we do have a lot of this AI access right now, but it's in beta, but the full versions are coming very soon. I mean, everybody's going to have access to this right away. It's not going to be a long wait, but most of it doesn't have anything to do with photography. I mean, things like visual intelligence is kind of on par with things like Google Lens and stuff. Take a photo and then you can evaluate what's in there and search things. And I want to buy this dress or I want to buy that hat or whatever. I mean, fair enough. But really in terms of photography, there's not much to talk about because Apple isn't really going very hard into generative AI for photography. I mean, Apple's only rolled out one generative fill feature for the camera app, and that's an eraser tool, something we've seen a lot from Google for multiple generations now. They're not touching anything else. And yeah, I mean, the Google Pixel has some crazy stuff. Being able to generate things with prompts. I mean, yes, it's fun when you're reviewing the phone, but I honestly haven't touched it since. But there are other generative fill features that I do like. Being able to move a subject to a different part of the frame, I could see how somebody might find that useful. Or being able to auto frame and generatively fill more in the composition so you can change things like your format, your composition, or just have a different viewpoint. That could be very useful too. A serious photographer, yeah, I'm still going to take raw files, go into Lightroom and edit them the way I would always do. But if I'm doing social media posts, it might be nice and handy to auto frame, recompose the image, and maybe move subject slightly. And that's something I cannot do on an iPhone. If you ask Apple, they're saying, well, their design philosophy is a photograph is a photograph, and they don't really want to go down that full AI road. And I get that mindset, I get that path, but regardless, there are some features that are very useful in other phones that you're not going to find here. So there's a lot to like about the iPhone 16 Pro as a photographic tool, but the fact is you'd really have to want to use things like the picture styles or the camera control buttons. Otherwise, as far as image quality goes, I don't think there's much improvement over an iPhone 15 Pro Max or Pro. That 5x zoom, if I really want it, I could get an iPhone 15 Pro Max and save myself some money. And you might even really prefer the 3x zoom like Jordan does. Well, stick with the iPhone 15 Pro. I'd only really look at this as a big photographic improvement if I was coming from something like a 12, 13, or 14. All right, I know that's a lot to cover, a lot of information, but hopefully you guys found this useful. Leave comments below. Let us know what you think about the new iPhone 16 Pro series of phones. Also, do check out the PetaPixel podcast. You know, we've been talking about this quite a bit. I'm sure we'll talk about it more. So check that out. It's the exact same YouTube channel as this, or go to all your favorite podcasting apps and listen to us while you're doing the dishes. Otherwise, do check out our merch store, store.petapixel.com. Get your latest hoodies and t-shirts today. There's lots of cool stuff there that you're going to enjoy. Thanks so much for joining us, guys. We'll see you soon with more on PetaPixel.